For 11 years, I slept in a room with a stone floor. And for 11 years, I never once asked myself what was underneath it. I just prayed and rested and trusted that the silence below me was simply silence. But one night, a Tuesday in early November, cold enough that the radiator ticked all evening, I heard something that changed everything. It was soft at first, almost like a murmur, then footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps coming from somewhere beneath the foundation of the convent. And I remember lying completely still, holding my breath, thinking to myself that sound is not the building settling. That sound is people. By the end of this story, you will understand why the greatest secret hidden beneath that convent was nothing like the terrifying thing I initially believed it to be. In fact, it was something I never expected, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about courage, silence, and what it truly means to protect the innocent. To understand why I started questioning the silence beneath the convent, you need to understand who I was before that November night. I came to the Sisters of St. Agatha in my late 20s. I was practical, organized, and deeply faithful, but not the type of faithful that floats through life on soft prayers and candlelight. My faith had edges. I asked questions. I wanted reasons. The other sisters used to tease me gently because I was always the one with a flashlight, inspecting the crumbling masonry along the east corridor or sketching the faded architectural details from the oldest wing. My assigned role was building maintenance and historical preservation. I loved that work. I loved the way old buildings carried stories inside their walls if you knew how to read them. The convent itself was extraordinary. It had been built in the 1840s on the edge of a small Pennsylvania town that most people drove through without stopping. The main building was 3 stories of dark fieldstone, and beneath it ran a basement level that nobody used anymore. The church records I managed described sealed storage rooms, old drainage tunnels, and a section of subfloor that had been closed off sometime around 1910 for reasons the documents described only as structural concern. There were local legends, of course. Townspeople talked about tunnels beneath the convent that connected to the old railway depot a half-mile away. Children dared each other to knock on the convent's side door after dark. But I never gave those stories much weight. I assumed they were exactly what they appeared to be, small-town folklore attached to a mysterious-looking building. Then came the November I just described. The morning after I heard those footsteps, I told myself I had been dreaming. But I started paying closer attention. 3 weeks later, I found something that I could not dismiss as imagination. I was replacing a cracked floor tile in the lower corridor, work nobody else wanted, and I noticed that the dust along the baseboard near the old sealed storeroom door had been disturbed. Not dramatically, just enough. A thin line where something had recently been dragged across the floor. I examined the door. It was still padlocked, but the metal around the hasp had fresh scratches on it. Silver scratches against old rust. Something had been through that lock recently. I mentioned it quietly to one of the senior sisters. She looked at the door for a long moment and then said the building was old and shifted constantly, and that I should not let my imagination get ahead of my duties. I accepted that, for a while, but I started keeping a small notebook. I wrote down dates, locations, and every detail that felt slightly wrong. A candle stub I found in the crawl space behind the chapel furnace room, still soft, meaning it had burned recently. A missing set of keys from the maintenance cabinet that reappeared 2 days later without explanation. The faint smell of coffee once drifting up through the floor grate in the early hours of the morning. Every clue had a possible explanation on its own. Together, they were beginning to tell a different story. Then I found the journal. It was tucked inside the hollow space behind a loose stone in the east stairwell, a space I had only noticed because I was measuring the wall for a repair estimate. The journal was old, dated entries from the 1970s, written in a careful hand that alternated between English and what I eventually identified as Polish. The name on the inside cover meant nothing to me at first, but the contents made my hands tremble. Whoever had written it described meetings, underground, beneath the convent, regular gatherings of people who referred to themselves simply as the custodians. I spent 3 weeks translating as much as I could, using a Polish dictionary from the convent library. What I understood suggested that these meetings had been happening for decades. The journal referenced older records. It mentioned names, dates, shipments, and something it called the collection, always with a capital C. It also contained a warning, written on the last filled page, in English. It said, "If you are reading this, and you do not already know why, then you must decide before you go further whether you are prepared to carry the weight of knowing." I should have stopped there. I did not. I found the entrance 3 months after I found the journal. It was beneath a removable section of flooring in the old coal storage room, a room I had been in dozens of times without ever standing in exactly the right spot. The hatch was wooden, old, and fitted so precisely into the floor that it was invisible unless you knew to look. I did not go down immediately. I stood there for a long time. I was afraid, not of ghosts or monsters, but of something more real than that. I was afraid of what it would mean to know. When I finally descended with my flashlight, I found a chamber roughly the size of a school classroom, with stone walls and a low arched ceiling. And what was inside that chamber stopped my breath completely. Along every wall, floor to ceiling, were shelves, hundreds of them, and on those shelves were documents, letters, photographs, ledgers, rolls of paper protected by cloth, bundles of folders tied with ribbon. All of it organized, labeled, carefully preserved. And in the center of the room, a table with chairs around it. Clean, used recently, a thermos of coffee sitting on the corner. I picked up one folder at random. Inside were court documents from the 1940s, sealed testimonies relating to atrocities committed against immigrant communities in the region, testimonies that the historical record suggested had been destroyed. I picked up another folder, photographs, dozens of families, names written on the back in multiple languages, and tucked into the photograph bundle, a handwritten letter explaining that these families had been moved safely through a network of shelters during a period of violent persecution in the 1950s and 1960s, and that the convent had been one of the primary shelters, a shelter that officially did not exist. I did not breathe properly for a long time, because I was beginning to understand something enormous. The custodians were not criminals. They were not a cult. They were not dangerous in the way I had feared. They were archivists, protectors, people who had spent generations collecting and preserving evidence of historical crimes, evidence that powerful people had worked very hard to erase. And they had been doing it beneath this convent because the convent had been trusted by their founders, because silence had been the only protection available to them. 2 nights later, they found me. Or rather, they let me find them. I had gone back to the chamber I could not stay away, and when I turned around, there were 3 people standing in the entrance. An elderly man with a cardigan and wire-rimmed glasses. A woman perhaps 10 years older than me, calm and watchful. And one of the sisters from my own community. A sister I had known for 8 years. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not guilt. Grief. The grief of someone who had carried a secret long enough to feel its weight permanently settled in their bones. She told me everything. The custodians had been formed in the 1890s by a group of clergy and laypersons who had witnessed the deliberate destruction of historical records, implicating local politicians and businessmen in the deaths of immigrant workers. They had preserved copies, and then they kept going through 2 world wars, through McCarthyism, through the Civil Rights era, through decades of political turbulence, quietly collecting evidence that someone powerful wanted gone. The collection now contained materials spanning over 100 years. Some of it was evidence of crimes that had never been prosecuted. Some of it was documentation of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things and received no recognition because acknowledging them would have been inconvenient for those in power. The sister looked at me steadily and said they had known I was getting close for weeks. They had debated telling me. Some of them had wanted to move everything, but she had argued to trust me. And then she asked me what I intended to do. That question broke something open inside me, because I did not know. Everything I had believed about transparency and truth suddenly felt less simple than it had before. Some of the families documented in those folders were still alive. Some of the individuals named in those sealed testimonies had powerful descendants who would not hesitate to act if the archive became public before it could be properly protected. The custodians were not hiding the truth to preserve injustice. They were hiding it to preserve the truth itself until it could be safely released without destroying the people connected to it. I sat with that for a long time. I prayed about it harder than I had prayed about anything in my life, and I made my choice. I did not expose them. I joined them, not in secret meetings beneath the floor, but in the careful, methodical work of creating copies, building relationships with historical preservation institutions, and establishing a legal framework through which the archive could eventually be donated to a university with protective conditions attached. It took 4 more years, but it happened. The collection was transferred with conditions that protected living family members while allowing historical researchers to access the records in a structured way. 3 of the testimonies it contained contributed to posthumous exonerations. One set of financial records prompted a formal historical inquiry that is still ongoing. Nobody knows my name in connection with any of it, and I am entirely at peace with that. Because what I learned in that chamber was not simply the secret of one organization operating beneath one old building. I learned that history is kept alive by ordinary people who chose to carry it when institutions refused to. People whose names were never written in the documents they protected. People who simply showed up month after month in a cold room beneath a stone floor because they believed the truth deserved a witness. Not every hidden secret exists to protect evil. Sometimes people choose silence because it is the only shelter available, because the world is not yet safe enough for the truth they are guarding, and sometimes the most faithful thing a person can do is wait quietly, patiently, in the dark until the moment arrives when the light can finally be let in without causing more damage than it heals. I think about that elderly man in the cardigan often. I think about the generations of people before him who came down those stairs without knowing whether anyone would ever come after them. They kept going anyway. That kind of faith does not require a pulpit. It just requires showing up. Now I want to hear from you. If you had been the one standing in that chamber, if you had seen everything I saw and understood everything I came to understand, would you have exposed the secret society? Or would you have protected what they were protecting? Leave your answer in the comments below. I genuinely want to know where you land on this because I still think about it every single day. And if this story kept you questioning every clue until the very last word, please share it with someone who loves a mystery that makes them think long after the screen goes dark. Those are the stories worth passing on.